This week on the agenda, Sanchez in China. As Spain's Prime Minister returns to Beijing, what does this visit say about the Spanish economy and the country's position on the world stage? Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is now back in Madrid after his fourth visit to China in as many years. He met President Xi Jinping, where the two talked trade, cooperation, and the importance of multipolarity. But what does this latest visit tell us about Spain's economic and political future? With me now are Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis, and Manuel Balmaseda, Director of the Instituto Espanol de Banca y Finanza and Professor of Economics at CUNEF Universidad. Thank you both for coming on the agenda. Manuel, let me start with you, because as we've said, this is Pedro Sanchez's fourth visit to China in as many years. What does this say to you about China's importance to Spain's economy?
I think the first key is that China is very important for every country, but in the case of Spain, it's the fourth largest trading partner, which shows that it's actually not a marginal relationship at all. It's actually very, very large, but it's also very unbalanced. Spain exports to China around 8 billion per year, while it imports around 50 billion. So it's a magnitude of 6. The trade deficit. In this case, but it's not only about trade. So trade is one of the key fundamentals and one of the key economic reasons why we had this visit, but it's also about investment. China is also matters as a source of investment, particularly investments in sectors like batteries or advanced manufacturing. We just had one announcement of an investment in Zaragoza from Cattle and Stellantis of over 4 billion euros in batteries, in a battery plant. So this relationship is very, very important for Spain because it's still very unbalanced. The key point is actually scale, this imbalance, and probably strategic investment.
Alicia, there's been a parade of European leaders heading to China. You know, I'm thinking about Germany's Oscar Schulz, the UK's Keir Starmer. They've all been this year. I mean, is there something different about what Spain is looking for? Do you think that all European leaders are looking for the same thing?
I would say that Spain's tone goes slightly beyond what Manuel said, receiving investment and rebalancing trade. France, for example, because of the G7 agenda, is very much into this global rebalancing story. I think Spain is, if you read it carefully, is really about strategic alignment. That's the word, alignment. That goes a little bit beyond. Yeah, you just said, multipolarity. That's not a word we use in our European language of foreign policy. We use multilateralism. It's not the same. So I would say that Spain, and this is related obviously to Spain's position versus Trump, is slightly, moving towards the narrative that in a way China rightly has, because that's its position in the world. I mean, it's very logical. Yeah, it's like China is starting in a position where there is a dominant power, the U.S., and China wants to achieve that position. So multipolarity is the way to go. But Europe is part of that multilateral system. Yeah, it's created multilateralism. So this perhaps soft but noticeable, at least for me, shift is something that I would not have seen in other leaders.
Manuel, let's zone back in on trade, because Sanchez described trade between China and Spain as one with an excessive deficit, but did seem hopeful after meeting President Xi that could be addressed. How do you see that happening?
I mean, going back to just talking about economics and talking about the deficit, the problem is that the deficit is structural. So it can only be reduced on the margins. It will not disappear easily, regardless of what anybody says. Given this, I think Spain, there's a lot of room for improvement. There is a lot of room of improvement, but that room for improvement means more access for Spanish exports to the Chinese market. We know that the Chinese economy is not the most open in terms of trade and or opening its market, and that would help. There are a lot of things, of that 8 billion that I mentioned, imports from China, in China from Spain, actually pretty much almost 20% is in agro industry. The agro industry still has a lot of potential, and I think that's something that you need to do. I think Spain is looking for having kind of a privileged relationship with China with respects to trade, but let's remember that the trade relationships between countries in the Eurozone or in the European Union and China are not a national decision. They're actually governed by European policy, and what Europe can do, or any country can do, can only affect in the margins, and not in the whole context of really changing the deficit figures that we've seen.
Alicia, President Xi spoke about Spain and China strengthening cooperation when it comes to trade, but also in what he called new energy and the intelligent economy. Where do you see the real opportunities?
China has been investing a lot in renewables, in green hydrogen in Europe, trying very much also to invest in the grid, as it did in Portugal. So I think that's what Xi Jinping is referring to. Let's not forget that these are strategic sectors. The grid is strategic asset. I find it very difficult to believe that anybody could invest in China's grid, to be frank. So we also have a lot of strategic investment in Spain in our ports from China, Barcelona. I mean, there's a lot, at least 4. So all of these things mean that while Spain is very open to receive investment, they have to be thought carefully, because there should be some kind of reciprocity in the type of investment that we receive. If these are strategic assets, I think Europeans, not only Spain for that matter, should be able to also invest in strategic assets in China. So I think this is the big conversation, to have the reciprocity of the relation.
Manuel, what do you think?
No, I think Alicia is completely right. I mean, I think it goes well beyond just increasing exports on the margin. The question is, and it's not just a relationship for Spain. Spain is actually Prime Minister or President Sanchez was one there, but it's a relationship that matters for the whole of Europe. What we're talking about is something about completely different, in particular because we are in a world right now with high tensions, geopolitical and geoeconomics. Let me go a little beyond that. I think it's not a matter of how do we change the scope. I think the question is that Spain, if you want, is a partner, but it's also a competitor and a systemic rival, not only Spain but Europe, and we need to change that. I think it is a question not of decoupling from China or rearranging, but of the risking, keeping dialogue and trade open, but where interests overlap. But at the same time, we need to reduce the vulnerabilities and insist on what Alicia just mentioned, reciprocity. So the agenda with respect to relationships between Europe and China are much more complex and let's say dynamic than otherwise. The case of Spain, I think, would be, in this case, probably the most pragmatic and open to trade and with China and other types of investments with China. And probably that was part of the visit that President Sanchez had there, how to open Europe through Spain to Chinese investments.
So we've talked quite a lot about business and investment dynamics, the opportunities, the challenges, the different sectors. But Alicia, they also discussed cultural cooperation in things like education, in things like sport. How important is that? Or at the end of the day, does it all boil down to the economy?
Hopefully not. Hopefully, Spain, whether it's its language or its culture, has around 400 million people, not Spain, but our culture. So it's pretty relevant, I would say, and I think China is very aware of this. So, trying to go beyond, that kind of Sino-British type, cultural relation. I think thinking about Spanish, again, not only the country, but the culture, Sino-Spanish cultural relation is a way to really do what Xi Jinping said, and rightly so, of making the world more multipolar. So it is actually very important. The question is, can we do this openly? Can we do this reciprocally? It would be lovely to have as many, again, Spanish-speaking, just to go beyond Spain, students in China than Chinese students in these Spanish-speaking countries, and nobody's here to blame because we're the first to blame. We should push for this. We should push to know China better, but that's the thing. We need to make it more balanced. Even this needs to be made more balanced because it's for everybody to win from that balanced cultural relation.
But Manuel, of course, all of this is against this really complicated geopolitical backdrop. We've got tensions. And Sanchez said in Beijing that if Spain, China and Europe have achieved shared prosperity in the past, then there's no reason why they can't do that again. How's that going to happen?
No, I think you just mentioned, actually, Alicia just mentioned education, culture, sports. I would argue that probably those are not the definite. I mean, they help, but they will not define the relationship. The relationship will be defined in terms of trade, investment, and geopolitics. However, those things generate a cultural link and generate a trust that makes the relationship much easier to manage. So I think the only way that we can, Spain, Europe, China can build on a future relationship is by looking beyond the current geopolitics, which tend to be very, very, very polarized. And I know it sounds a little, easy, but look at the things that actually unify us more than those that divide us, in the sense that there are a lot of things in the agenda that are quite common that can be helped. But each one has to understand, and in particular, China needs to understand that reciprocity is key, and that it's easier, or let's put it this way: Europe has opened its, economies and its culture and everything to China for the last few years, decades, and now it's time for China to do likewise. And building on that connection, we might move forward. And that's probably the only way that we can do that, and probably go around the geopolitics. The geopolitics are going to be there. They're going to be there probably for the long haul. Alicia mentioned multipolarity, and the question here is, where does Europe stand in that multipolar world if it's not going to be a multilateral, world? I'm one of those optimists that thinks that globalization will continue somehow, right? But it doesn't seem the case right now.
Manuel Balmaseda, Alicia Garcia Herrero, always a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Pedro Sanchez arrived in Beijing against a backdrop of unprecedented global tension and as the most outspoken European leader against the US-Israeli attacks on Iran. While in China, he spoke out against the possibility of a new Cold War, as President Xi warned of a crumbling global order. So how might Spain and China work together to address these geopolitical issues? Joining me now is Spain's former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ana Palacio. Great to have you back on the agenda, Ana. Now, as I mentioned there, Pedro Sanchez arrived in Beijing as the most outspoken European voice against the attacks in Iran. Is Spain trying to lead on the global stage, do you think? And is it stepping out of line with Europe?
Well, it's true that Pedro Sanchez has taken an extreme position in criticizing and countering the United States in many areas. And you can see this from different angles, but one that you cannot forget is that Spain is frankly in a pre-elections condition, and it's always, and this is not just Pedro Sanchez, any politician when facing pre-election, well, the world is a safe place, particularly if you are surrounded by challenges, and honestly, Pedro Sanchez is surrounded by big challenges in Spain.
Now, Sanchez suggested in one of the speeches he made in Beijing that China may be the only power capable of resolving the crisis in Iran. Is Spain positioning itself as what some have called a middle power broker between China, the EU, and the US over the Iran conflict?
Well, first off, it's true that Europeans have perceived that China has been very hands-off on this conflict. And also, it's clear that all Europeans know that China is a leading actor when it chooses to be one, when it chooses to involve itself in something. I think that as a Spain power broker between the European Union and China and the United States, it's complicated. We cannot be power brokers with the European Union because we are European Union. We belong to the European Union. So I think that we have to make our best to have better relations with China or between China and Brussels and the other capitals.
What do you make of Spain's outspoken opposition to the conflict in Iran?
Well, I think that, again, you have this internal situation of Spain where being against war, everybody is against war. And it's, the difficulty would be in pre-election moment to be for war. That's complicated. Yeah. Or even for us Europeans, our biggest challenge is to realize that in this new world, we need to pay for our defense. We need to invest in our defense. And even to tell them that we will have to make just arbitrages between social expenditures and defense is complicated. It's not for elections. Yeah. We will see how all this ends up. But the truth is that in Europe in general, and in Spain in particular, we make a difference between President Trump and United States. United States is still today perceived as indispensable in NATO framework, in defense framework.
You say that Spain is the European Union. So what does all of this say about European Union unity?
Well, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Europeanist. And what we have, we tend to belittle what we have achieved. And what we have achieved is fantastic. But the European Union has never had, and before that, the European communities, never the project was about defense. The European project was about internal stability, about internal peace in a continent that we have been killing each other every other generation for generations. And frankly, the two world wars were something that made us react and say, we have to have peace in the continent. And this is the project. Defense has never been a competence of the European Union. And today we have this idea of industry, defense industry, through which we try to coordinate. It's a change of mentality. It's not easy, but we will. We will. I'm absolutely sure that as in other areas, we will overcome the difficulties.
President Xi talked about this crumbling world order, and I wonder if you think that Spain's strategic autonomy is a genuine shift, or if Europe will fall back on NATO when the pressure rises. I know you think that the emphasis on defence is a bit complicated, but what do you think?
Well, these, in my opinion, are two different issues. We have a world order that is under very big strain, and frankly, I would say unraveling. And on the other hand, President Xi's declarations on the four global initiatives are pretty much supporting the existing formal rules-based order and therefore institutions, and in particular the UN. So there, I think that there is a commonality between China and the European Union. We think, and in general, Canada and many, I would say, except now, and this is the paradox, that this global order was the creation, first and foremost, of the United States, not exclusively of the United States, but they were the ones that inspired or were in the forefront. So let's see, again, United States is not President Trump. Let's see. And in the meantime, let's try to reinforce China from its perspective, which is not exactly the same, but we want to keep this order, and the European Union, and as I say, Canada, and by the way, the global South in general, there is there is an interest, and there China plays a key role.
You mentioned the United Nations, and when Pedro Sanchez was in China, he did talk about reshaping multilateralism, strengthening the UN General Assembly, and making the Security Council more representative. You talked about the Global South, for example. So how do you think all of that would have gone down in Beijing, and how might it actually come about?
In general terms, I think that when you see President Xi trajectory, President Xi has recovered the protagonism that China always had from the beginning. Even, present at the beginning, China is the first signatory of the San Francisco Charter, and China has been involved many times, bringing in, and this I'm quoting Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, that was the head of the delegation in the Human Rights Declaration, bringing in the values of Asia, this idea of the importance of the collective, of the importance of the president, of the importance of security. But China had an important role in the drafting and in the debates of the Charter, the first signatory, and of the Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that China has gone for a period that did not highlight this, because this was a nationalist government. But now President Xi Jinping is feeling very comfortable in recovering this memoir. And frankly, we have seen this in the celebrations of the end of the Second World War. So we need to count on China. China is a key actor, and we need to expect that there will be a better approach with a different administration. And administrations just have a elapsing time that comes inexorably.
You're talking about China as a key actor. We've been talking about the United Nations. We've been talking about the European Union. And in Sanchez's speech at Tsinghua University, he said, without a united EU, there will be no stable global order. Just as without China's participation, the world cannot truly achieve true stability and prosperity. But certainly when it comes to Iran, it's not entirely clear that the EU is united, is it?
Well, again, the European Union was not aimed at the world that we are living now. The European Union is a union in peace, in a broth of peace. But we are adapting. And I think that we have to bet on adaptation and not just start self-criticizing and self-flagellating. We will achieve unity. And I think I agree with this idea that, of course, there is no there is no multilateral system without an important participation and an important involvement of China. And honestly, I think that the European Union can and will play united, because a disunited European Union is a kind of oxymoron. The thing is that we have to address areas that were not there in our original project.
Do you think that Sanchez's comments in China signal a shift away from US leadership in global crisis management? Is this part of the crumbling world order that President Xi speaks about?
Well, I think that you have to address this declaration within the framework of Sanchez having taken, for different reasons, but I would say one reason of weight is the pre-electoral situation that we have in Spain, and the fact that the United States under Trump is not popular in Europe. I mean, Trump has insulted the Europeans. Trump has threatened to invade European territory. Trump belittles the Europeans. Trump despises the Europeans. Even Meloni, that was one of her friends. So he's not liked in Europe. Whatever you say against today, I make the difference between the United States and President Trump. But of course, today the United States is President Trump. So it's very popular to be against the United States. It's much more difficult to be Atlanticist.
And Sanchez has been to China 4 times in the last 4 years. I mean, let's throw it forward and look at the next 4 or 5 years. Where do you think that the relationship will stand between Spain and China in what Sanchez called an increase in multipolarity?
Well, multipolarity is one issue, and we have to work. I don't like multipolarity. I like multilateralism, because multipolarity means that there are different poles, and I like better different sides. Multilateralism, we are together in something, and we are the sides of this unity. But I mean, I bet on the relations between China and Spain within the framework of the European Union, working with the European Union. And frankly, I was in government long time ago, but we bet on the best relations with China, because China is an extremely important actor in the world today in different areas. You have spoken previously about the economy. We need to address our deficit, not just Spain, the European Union. We need to find a better balance. And all this is what we have to do now with China.
Ana Palacio, thank you very much.
My great pleasure and great honor. Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, a question of data. Who's really in control of our online information? And what is it actually worth? But for now, from me, Juliet, Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.